In the devastating winter of 1878, 28 out of 38 souls in the High Plains settlement of Blackwood Basin froze to death inside their own homes, while a 20-year-old exiled woman and her native father-in-law slept comfortably in 64-degree warmth inside a humble sod cabin everyone had written off as a hopeless disaster. Her name was Clara Whitlock, and before the cold came to claim the territory, she had believed she understood what it meant to endure a mountain winter. Born in the damp farmland of Ohio and brought west across the Platte River when she was 16, Clara was no stranger to frost creeping under doorframes or water freezing solid in wash basins before dawn. But the high plains of the Wyoming Territory were not Ohio. Out here, where the sagebrush stretched in endless gray waves toward the jagged teeth of the Rocky Mountains, the wind was not merely weather. It was an aggressive, living force that scoured the earth, searching for any structural weakness and stripping warmth from wood and bone alike. Clara had learned the true weight of that landscape, not from the weather at first, but from the people who lived in it. In May of 1878, she had married Elliot Hawk, a quiet 24-year-old blacksmith and trapper whose father was Shoshone and whose mother had been an English settler's daughter. To the self-righteous leaders of Blackwood Basin, a small trading post town nestled where two mountain creeks met, the marriage was considered an unforgivable betrayal. The town council, led by a prosperous merchant and magistrate named Gideon Vance, did not drive them out with rifles or open violence. Instead, they used the cruel, silent weapons of frontier exile. Within a single week, store accounts were closed to them, the local smithy refused to sell Elliott iron bar stock, and neighbors turned their backs whenever Clara walked down the muddy main street. The final blow had come from Abigail Vance, Gideon's 19-year-old daughter, who had been Clara's closest friend since their wagons joined the same trail herd years before. On a warm afternoon in early June, Abigail rode out to the boundary line of Clara's homestead, stopping her horse 20 yards from the yard. She dropped a small woven basket into the dry grass, refusing to step any closer. When Clara walked out to meet her, hoping for a single word of comfort, Abigail merely looked at her with a heavy, suffocating pity. Inside the basket were Clara's old sewing needles, a tin cup, and a small stack of letters from her family back east. Abigail told her that her father had ordered everything belonging to Clara purged from the town, and that the minister had prayed for her soul because she had thrown her life away to live among savages. Before turning her horse back toward Blackwood Basin, Abigail looked at the modest half-sod cabin sitting out on the exposed prairie and told Clara that when the first Arctic blizzard swept down off the mountains, she and her new family would freeze out there alone, with no one left to help them. Clara did not cry. She picked up the basket, turned her back on the town that had rejected her, and walked toward the small homestead 4 miles out in the sagebrush. It was a simple home, built half-buried in a gentle prairie slope with sod bricks stacked over a cedar pole frame. It looked fragile, almost pathetic against the vast empty sky. But Clara was stubborn, and she loved her husband, and she was determined to prove to the people of Blackwood Basin that she could make a life where they said nothing could survive. Before we continue with how Clara faced the most terrifying winter in Wyoming history, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Every week, we bring you real survival stories and forgotten techniques from the American frontier that proved how ingenuity and courage could overcome the impossible. Drop a comment below and let us know where you are watching from today. Standing in the doorway of the cabin that evening, looking out at the vast expanse of high plains where the autumn wind was already beginning to turn cold, Clara realized that her battle for survival had officially begun. She had no idea that the old man sitting by the cold hearth inside was about to teach her a secret that would shock the entire territory. The man who held the key to their survival was Elliot's father, a 72-year-old Shoshone elder named Katsa, whom the townspeople dismissively referred to as Old Cass. Katsa was a man made of sinew and deep, quiet patience, with a face lined like a dried creek bed and dark eyes that seemed to notice every shift in the grass long before anyone else. He spoke very little English, choosing instead to communicate through subtle gestures, deliberate actions, and the quiet authority of someone who had watched 7 decades of mountain winters pass across the plains. Katsa had a habit that Clara had initially found bizarre. Morning and night, he would take long ribbons of inner chokecherry bark, which he harvested from the creek bottoms, fold them carefully into his cheek, and chew on them for hours. When he was thinking or studying the sky, he would sit on a stone outside the cabin, chewing his bark in complete silence, completely unbothered by the cold wind that made Clara shiver inside her wool shawl. On a crisp September morning, just as the first hint of gold was appearing on the mountain aspens, Katsa walked out of the cabin carrying 2 hand-carved wooden paddles. Each paddle was roughly 3 feet long, flattened at the blade, and worn smooth from years of handling. He motioned for Clara to follow him behind the cabin, where the ground sloped gently upward toward a low limestone ridge. Katsa walked 25 paces up the incline, stopped, and drew a long, sweeping line in the dry earth with the heel of his moccasin. The line did not run straight up or down the hill, nor did it enclose a garden or outline a building. Instead, it formed a wide, gentle curve that followed the exact contour of the slope, pointing about 15 degrees away from the direction of the prevailing northwest winds. He handed one of the wooden paddles to Clara, pointed to the marked line, and made a shallow digging motion. When Clara looked at him in confusion, trying to ask what they were building, Katsa simply placed his hand over hers, guided the paddle into the sod, and lifted a thin, 2-inch slice of earth. He gestured for her to continue along the line, cutting a shallow groove no deeper than the width of a hand from wrist to finger, and piling the turned sod along the lower edge to form a tiny ridge. To Clara, coming from a family of traditional Ohio farmers who believed in deep plowing and square fence lines, the task seemed utterly ridiculous. The ditch was far too shallow to drain water, entirely useless for planting crops, and completely incapable of acting as a defensive barrier or a stock pen. It looked like nothing more than a pointless scar dragged across the grass. When Elliot returned that evening from setting beaver traps along the upper creek, Clara showed him the shallow trench and asked why his father was wasting their precious autumn days on something so seemingly meaningless. Elliot sat on the edge of the wash bench, washed the trail dust from his face, and looked out at the hill where his father was still quietly working in the fading light. Elliot explained that his father had lived through winters that killed entire herds of bison and turned whole mountain valleys into frozen graveyards. He told Clara that Katsa did not believe in explaining things with long speeches because words were easily forgotten when panic set in. Instead, he taught by forcing the hands to learn the work first, trusting that when the storm finally arrived, the reason behind the labor would become instantly clear. Elliot urged her to trust the old man's memory, assuring her that in 50 years on the high plains, Katsa had never once misread the coming of a winter. Grumbling softly to herself, Clara returned to the slope the next morning. Her arms ached and her palms developed raw blisters, but she continued digging alongside the silent old man. As they worked, Katsa would occasionally stop, lift a handful of dirt, and let it fall through his fingers to check its moisture, or pause to watch the flight patterns of high-altitude geese moving south far ahead of their usual schedule. He was listening to a language Clara could not yet read, preparing a defense against an enemy she had not yet seen. Word of the strange activity at the outcast homestead quickly traveled along the wagon road back to Blackwood Basin. Settlers riding past on their way to the timber stands would rein in their horses at the property line, watching with open amusement as the young white woman and the old Shoshone man spent their days digging a shallow dirt line on a barren hillside. By early October, the amusement turned into public mockery. Gideon Vance himself rode out to the property one afternoon, accompanied by the town's primary timber builder, a burly carpenter named Thomas Miller, who prided himself on constructing heavy, square-hewn log cabins. The two men stood near the property boundary, refusing to step onto the land, and watched as Katsa and Clara began the next phase of their work. Katsa had spent 2 weeks hauling flat, heavy riverstones up from the creek bed using a simple wooden travois. Now, he was dry stacking these stones in a low, thick wall exactly 10 inches away from the cabin's outer sod wall. The stone barrier was built without mortar, set carefully stone by stone, leaving a continuous 10-inch gap between the rough rock and the turf of the inner building. Even stranger to the onlookers was what Katsa was putting into that 10-inch cavity. Clara was carrying large sacks of wheat and oat chaff, the lightweight discarded husks left over from the late summer threshing, and packing them densely into the space between the stone wall and the sod structure. Gideon Vance leaned over his saddle horn and called out to Clara, his voice dripping with condescension. He asked her if her new family had run so short of intelligence that they were using farm trash to hold up a house. Thomas Miller laughed loudly, adding that stuffing wall cavities with dry plant husks was a guaranteed recipe for disaster. He claimed the chaff would attract every field mouse in the territory within a week, absorb dampness from the autumn fogs, rot the cedar poles, and eventually spark spontaneous combustion that would burn the entire cabin to the ground before Christmas. Gideon told Clara that if she wanted to repent of her foolishness and leave the half-breed and his father, her family might still find a place for her as a domestic servant in town. Otherwise, he warned, she was tying her fate to people who clearly knew nothing about building a proper home capable of withstanding a Wyoming winter. Katsa did not look up from his stone stacking. He selected a flat slab of gray sandstone, checked its weight and balance, and set it firmly into place over the chaff layer. Clara, despite feeling her face flush with anger and embarrassment, ignored Gideon's offer and continued packing the golden husks firmly into the gap between the walls. As Gideon and Miller finally rode away, their laughter echoing across the open range, Clara looked at the structure they were creating. From the outside, the cabin now looked stranger than ever. It was a low, heavy mound of earth, surrounded by a thick, rough ring of river rock, with a shallow ditch curving around the hill behind it like an unfinished mark in the dirt. It possessed none of the neat, square symmetry of the timber houses being erected in Blackwood Basin, where fresh pine logs were being notched and caulked with thick white lime mortar. To the residents of the settlement, proper building meant thick wood, heavy iron nails, and tight seals that fought against the elements. What Clara and Katsa were building looked primitive, crude, and messy. But as the last days of autumn faded, and the air grew so cold that the morning grass crunched underfoot like broken glass, Clara began to notice something subtle. Inside their strange, double-walled shelter, the air felt different. It felt quiet, still, and strangely expectant, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for the mountains to deliver their blow. It was in mid-October, while Elliot was out hunting deer to lay in winter meat, that Katsa finally explained to Clara why they had dug the shallow groove on the hillside. They were sitting near the outside wall of the cabin during the quiet warmth of late afternoon, and Katsa used a smooth stick to draw diagrams in the dust, speaking in a mixture of broken words and clear, expressive hand movements. Katsa showed her how the wind moved across the flat, open plains. When a gale swept down from the northwest at 50 miles an hour, it behaved like a massive river of invisible water. If that river of cold air hit a flat, square wall head-on like the heavy timber cabins built in Blackwood Basin, it created immense pressure against the wood. The wind would force its way through the tiniest microscopic cracks in the chinking, scouring heat away from the exterior surfaces through a process that stripped warmth far faster than quiet, freezing air ever could. The shallow 25-pace trench they had dug along the slope was designed to exploit fluid dynamics and boundary layer airflow. Katsa showed Clara how the shallow curve in the low ridge of turned sod acted as an aerodynamic wedge. When the heavy, cold surface air rushing down the hill encountered that subtle dip in the ground, the air molecules were forced to compress and lift slightly. This created what Katsa called a wind shadow, a localized zone of low pressure that extended several yards downstream from the trench. Instead of the Arctic gales slamming directly into the north wall and door of the cabin, the main force of the wind was lifted and deflected in a smooth arch over the top of the roof. Clara listened in absolute fascination as the true genius of the design dawned on her. The trench was not meant to stop the wind through sheer strength, which was impossible on the open plains. It was designed to trick the wind into lifting itself away from the living space. To prove his point, Katsa picked up a handful of dried thistle down and walked up to the slope behind the cabin. As a brisk autumn breeze blew down the hill, he tossed the down into the air right above the trench. Instead of blowing straight into Clara's face as she stood by the cabin door, the light fluffy seeds rose upward in a smooth curve, sailing harmlessly 10 feet above the cabin roof before settling into the grass far downwind. Clara stood in the quiet pocket of air near the door, feeling barely a flutter of breeze on her cheeks, while the grass at the top of the ridge bowed low under the force of the wind. She realized then that the town builders in Blackwood Basin were operating on a dangerous flaw. They believed that surviving the wilderness meant building rigid, unyielding boxes that fought the environment with brute force. Katsa understood that the wilderness was far too powerful to be fought that way. The key to survival was understanding the natural physics of the landscape and guiding its dangerous forces harmlessly away. Next, Katsa revealed the true purpose of the 10-inch gap packed with chaff and enclosed by riverstone. Clara had assumed the stones were meant to act as a solid barrier against the cold, but Katsa quickly corrected her understanding of how heat moved through solid materials. Heavy riverstone and dense field rock are excellent at absorbing heat, but they are also rapid conductors of cold when exposed directly to freezing winds. A solid stone wall, without an internal break, will draw heat out of a warm room and dump it into the frozen outside air almost as fast as an iron plate. On the other hand, bare sod walls, while decent at insulating, tend to dry out, contract, and develop tiny hairline fissures over time that allow cold air to leak into the home. The 10-inch space, filled with oat and wheat chaff, solved both problems simultaneously through advanced principles of insulation and thermal resistance. Katsa explained that plant husks were not trash. They were nature's hollow containers. Each grain husk contained thousands of microscopic, silica-coated pockets of trapped air. When packed tightly into the wall gap, the millions of husks prevented air molecules from moving or creating rolling convection loops inside the wall cavity. Because the air was held completely stationary within the chaff, heat could not travel through it easily. In modern building terms, that simple 10-inch cavity, filled with dry agricultural husks, created an extraordinary thermal barrier with an estimated rating of R26. It completely decoupled the cold outer riverstone wall from the warm inner sod envelope. When the sun shone on the dark riverstones during the day, the rocks absorbed solar radiation and warmed up. At night, the stone released that heat slowly. But because the chaff barrier prevented the heat from escaping outward, the warmth was directed inward toward the sod wall. Conversely, the heat generated by the small iron cooking stove inside the cabin was trapped by the inner sod wall and reflected back into the room, unable to pass through the chaff barrier to the cold outside world. Stay with us, because when the temperature dropped to 35 degrees below zero during the third night of the November blizzard, Clara would be forced to make a split-second decision regarding this wall insulation that would determine whether her family lived or died. Katsa had designed a complete thermal envelope that required almost no energy to maintain. The inner living space became a heat retention chamber that stayed warm long after the stove fire had burned down to gentle coals. Clara walked around the building, touching the dry chaff packed beneath the top row of stone caps. She could feel the gentle warmth lingering in the husks, even as the late afternoon air turned crisp and frosty. She realized that while the townspeople of Blackwood Basin were busy cutting down acres of timber to burn in inefficient fireplaces, she and Katsa had created a self-sustaining heat battery using stones from the creek and husks from the harvest. As October gave way to the sharp, bitter cold of early November, Katsa spent an afternoon teaching Clara about the final piece of his winter preparation, the medicinal science behind the chokecherry bark he chewed so faithfully. He gathered several long strips of the dark reddish-brown inner bark from his storage bundles and showed Clara how to peel the soft, fibrous layer away from the tough outer casing. He explained that the bitter taste came from powerful natural compounds, salicin, astringent tannins, and complex plant resins. When chewed slowly, the bark released a steady stream of anti-inflammatory and antiseptic agents that coated the throat and bronchial tubes with a protective lining. In the dry, frigid air of a high plains winter, cold air breathed directly into the lungs could cause micro-tears in delicate tissues, leading to the wet, racking coughs that frequently developed into fatal pneumonia among young children and the elderly on the frontier. The bark kept the respiratory lining resilient and reduced inflammation before infection could take root. Katsa prepared a small bundle of the peeled bark ribbons for Clara, instructing her to begin chewing a small piece every morning as soon as the first hard frost settled over the valley. Though the taste was intensely bitter and made her mouth pucker at first, she soon noticed that her throat felt moist and clear even when working outside in the biting wind. Meanwhile, 4 miles away in Blackwood Basin, the townspeople were preparing for winter in the only way they knew how. Clara watched from the hillside as heavy timber wagons hauled load after load of green, freshly cut pine logs into town. The settlers were stacking their firewood in massive open piles directly against the outside walls of their cabins, fully exposed to rain, sleet, and snow. They believed that having huge piles of wood was all that mattered. They did not understand that storing green, unseasoned timber in open weather meant the wood would absorb ambient moisture, freeze into solid icy blocks, and burn at less than half its potential efficiency when placed in a hearth. The townspeople continued to rely on their single-wall timber cabins with rigid wood frames that expanded and contracted with temperature shifts, slowly cracking the lime mortar, chinking and creating invisible channels for the wind. They were building a massive demand for heat, while simultaneously sabotaging the efficiency of the very fuel meant to supply it. In the second week of November, Elliot was forced to leave the homestead for a mandatory 10-day journey to the Indian Agency 60 miles west to trade furs for winter salt, lead, and black powder. He was hesitant to leave Clara and his aging father alone, as the weather turned increasingly ominous, but the supplies were essential for their survival. Before he rode out, Elliot checked the cabin's timber frame, ensured the chimney collar was clear, and kissed Clara goodbye. Katsa stood on the rocky ridge behind the cabin, chewing his chokecherry bark and watching the sky. The clouds were gathering in thin, flat, lead-colored ribbons high above the mountain peaks, moving with a strange, quiet speed that signaled the arrival of something massive. Clara stood beside the old man, her wool shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She looked out across the gray prairie, toward the distant houses of Blackwood Basin, where thin lines of blue smoke were already rising from 11 stone chimneys. The town was confident, secure in its wealth and timber. Clara looked at her strange, earth-mounded home, touched the warm stone wall at her side, and prepared herself for the storm that was about to test them all. The storm struck on the night of the 12th of November 1878, with a sudden, violent fury that caught the entire territory unprepared. It was an Arctic bomb cyclone, a massive polar air mass that roared down from western Canada, dropping the 10 now less 20 Mary clone. By midnight, the wind was screaming across the Wyoming plains at 55 miles an hour, driving a wall of fine, needle-sharp snow horizontally across the landscape. The temperature plummeted to 35 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, a level of cold so intense that tree trunks in the creek bottoms cracked open with sounds like rifle shots as the sap inside froze solid and expanded. In Blackwood Basin, the storm immediately exposed the lethal flaws in traditional frontier architecture. As the gale-force winds slammed into the flat, square walls of the timber cabins, the extreme pressure forced cold air through every microscopic gap in the mortared chinking. The single-wall pine logs, containing no thermal break or internal air gap, began conducting the Arctic freeze directly into the living spaces. To fight the plummeting indoor temperatures, the townspeople built roaring fires in their fireplaces and iron stoves. But the firewood they had stored outdoors in open piles was frozen solid and coated in ice. When thrown onto the hearths, the wet logs hissed, smoldered, and struggled to combust, generating thick, acrid clouds of creosote smoke instead of clean, radiant heat. Within hours, the cabins in town were filled with choking smoke. Families were forced to choose between cracking windows to vent the fumes which instantly let in sub-zero air or suffocating in the dark. Water stored in wooden buckets near the indoor hearths froze solid. Ice formed thick white crusts along the inside nail heads and wall seams. To keep their homes above freezing, the settlers burned wood at a terrifying rate, throwing 50 to 60 logs a day onto their fires, consuming a full quart of firewood every 2.5 days. By the third night of the storm, Several families in town had burned through their entire dry wood reserves and were forced to break up wooden furniture, fences, and barn planks to feed their dying hearths. Children began coughing that deep, wet, rattling cough that signals the onset of severe bronchial inflammation. In the home of Magistrate Gideon Vance, the indoor temperature could not be raised above 30 degrees, despite 2 stoves running at maximum capacity. Abigail Vance huddled under 6 wool blankets beside her shivering mother, watching her breath freeze into clouds in the middle of their parlor, listening to the wind roar against the rattling timber walls like a battering ram. The town's pride and expensive timber construction were proving completely useless against an environment that refused to play by human rules. The wind was stripping heat away faster than the smoldering, damp fires could produce it, turning the neat, square houses of Blackwood Basin into freezing wooden boxes. 4 miles out on the open prairie, inside the half-sod cabin of Clara Whitlock and Katsa, the reality of the blizzard was astonishingly different. While the 55-mile-an-hour gales howled across the hillside, the shallow, 25-pace trench they had dug back in September performed its aerodynamic task with flawless precision. The wind, encountering the subtle slope curve and sod ridge, was forced to lift and arch upward, creating a calm wind shadow directly over the cabin. The howling gales swept harmlessly overhead, leaving the area around the front door almost completely still. Inside the cabin, the temperature held steady at a comfortable 64 degrees Fahrenheit. The small iron cooking stove required only 6 to 8 modest logs per day to keep the space warm, an 80% reduction in fuel usage compared to the frantic consumption happening in town. The 10-inch chaff wall was demonstrating its incredible thermal power. On the 4th morning of the storm, Clara put on her heavy mittens and stepped into the small corridor between the inner sod wall and the outer stone barrier to check the temperature gradient. Using a small glass thermometer that had belonged to her father, she measured the outer face of the riverstone wall exposed to the storm. It read 25 degrees below zero. She then placed the thermometer against the inner sod wall inside the living room. It registered 58 degrees above zero. Across a simple 10-inch gap packed with dry grain husks, there was an extraordinary 83-degree temperature differential. The cold was completely trapped and neutralized within the dead air pockets of the chaff, unable to cross the barrier into the living space. Because the dry chaff prevented heat from escaping, the heat produced by their small stove remained inside the room, absorbed by the thick sod walls, and radiated back into the living area. The air inside smelled faintly of dry straw, sweet cedar, and warm earth. There was no smoke, no dampness, and no frost on the walls. Clara and Katsa sat near the table in their ordinary indoor clothing, completely sheltered from the Arctic fury raging outside. However, the storm required active maintenance to keep the passive systems working. Every 6 hours, Clara had to bundle herself in her heavy coat, wrap a wool scarf around her face, and step out into the wind shadow behind the cabin, carrying her wooden paddle. Snowdrifts were attempting to fill the shallow trench on the hillside. If the ditch became completely packed with drifted snow, the aerodynamic curve would be lost, allowing the wind to drop back down and slam directly into the cabin door. Working in the roaring dark, with the wind whistling inches above her head, Clara shoveled the accumulated snow out of the trench, tossing it downwind to keep the airflow channel clear. Her muscles ached and her face felt numb from the flying ice crystals, but she remembered Katsa's lesson. Survival was not a single act, but a continuous discipline of keeping the system clear so nature could do the heavy lifting. On the 4th night of the blizzard, the storm reached its absolute peak. The temperature outside dropped to an unprecedented 37 degrees below zero, and the wind gusts exceeded 60 miles an hour, shaking the heavy cedar rafters of the cabin. Inside, a new crisis emerged. Katsa, whose aged body had been pushed to its limits during the autumn preparations, developed a sudden, severe chill. His breath became shallow and labored, and a high fever took hold of him, leaving him bedridden on his pallet near the hearth. Clara was suddenly thrust into full responsibility for maintaining the home and caring for the sick elder while the worst storm in decades battered the prairie outside. She wrapped Katsa in extra buffalo robes, prepared a hot decoction of boiled chokecherry bark and dried wild mint, and carefully spooned the bitter liquid between his lips to keep his airways open and his fever managed. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, as the wind screamed with a terrifying, high-pitched wail overhead, Clara stepped into the wall corridor to inspect the insulation. To her horror, she saw that a tiny section of the top stone capping had shifted under the vibration of the storm, allowing a strong draft to reach the upper layer of chaff. The wind was beginning to lift the dry husks out of the gap, scattering golden chaff flakes into the air. Panicking, Clara feared that the entire insulation layer would be sucked out of the wall and blown away into the night, leaving the sod cabin exposed to the killing frost. In her moment of desperation, she remembered the extra sacks of chaff stored inside the warm cabin. Her immediate instinct was to pull all the chaff out of the wall cavity, bring it inside the warm room to protect it, and stuff it back into the wall after the storm passed. She reached up to grab a handful of the chaff, ready to begin emptying the wall gap. But just as her fingers touched the dry husks, Katsa's voice echoed sharply in her memory, the strict, uncompromising warning he had given her on his sickbed weeks before. Never bring the chaff into the damp warmth of the room during a cold snap. The husks will absorb the indoor moisture from your breath and cooking, and when you put it back into the wall, that moisture will freeze solid into an ice block, destroying the dead air pockets forever. Clara froze. She realized that her emotional impulse to rescue the material would actually destroy its scientific function. She had to trust the physics of the system, even when her fear urged her to interfere. Instead of pulling the chaff out, Clara grabbed several flat riverstones from the reserve stack near the door. Braving the freezing draft in the corridor, she climbed a small wooden bench and carefully reset the shifted top stones, wedging them tightly into place over the gap and sealing the top seal against the wind. She packed a fresh handful of dry reserve chaff into the small depression, set the heavy stones firmly on top, and checked the draft. The air movement stopped instantly. The chaff remained sealed in its dark, motionless cavity, holding its dead air pockets intact. Clara stepped back into the warm living room, wiped the sweat and cold condensation from her forehead, and sat beside Katsa's pallet. She checked his face. His breathing had calmed, his skin felt cooler, and the chokecherry tea had done its work. The fever had broken. She sat in the quiet, warm, 64-degree room, listening to the storm rage impotently against the outer stone shell. She looked at the old Shoshone man sleeping peacefully, then at her own hands, calloused and strong from months of hard labor. She knew that she was no longer the helpless, frightened girl who had been cast out of Blackwood Basin in June. She had learned the deep, quiet laws of the earth, and those laws had held her safe through the darkest night of the year. On the morning of the 7th day, the 18th of November, 1878, the great blizzard finally broke. The howling wind died away completely, leaving an absolute, unnatural silence hanging over the high plains. The sky cleared to a brilliant, blinding blue, and a cold sun shone down on a landscape transformed into an endless desert of sculpted white snowdrifts. Clara stepped out of the cabin door into the crisp, biting air. The snow was piled 8 feet high around the sides of the property, but the area directly in front of the door, protected by the wind shadow of the trench, was swept almost completely clear. She walked up the hillside, her boots crunching sharply on the frozen crust, and looked 4 miles to the east toward the valley where Blackwood Basin lay. In normal weather, the morning view of the town was marked by thick, cheerful columns of wood smoke rising from 11 chimneys into the clear mountain sky. Clara strained her eyes, looking across the vast white expanse. There was no smoke, not a single plume, not a wisp, not a trace of gray vapor rose from the settlement. The valley lay completely still, shrouded in a deathly, terrifying silence that made Clara's heart cold in her chest. At that moment, the sound of horses crunching through the snowdrifts made her turn. Elliot was riding up the ridge, leading a pack mule loaded with trade goods from the agency. He had been caught in the storm 30 miles west, taking shelter in a deep sandstone canyon he and his father had used for years, waiting out the weather before pushing his horses through the drifts to get home. He dismounted and held Clara tightly, relief washing over him, as he saw that she was unharmed, and the cabin stood completely intact. He looked over her shoulder at his father, who stepped out of the cabin door, wrapped in a blanket, looking rested and healthy. Then Elliot turned and looked toward Blackwood Basin. He too noticed the complete absence of chimney smoke. He knew what a total lack of fires meant after 7 days of 35 below zero cold. Something catastrophic had happened to the town that had driven them out. Without hesitation, Clara and Elliot began packing their horse-drawn wooden sled. They loaded it with 2 large copper kettles of rich, hot venison broth. Clara had prepared several wool blankets, a bundle of dry firewood, and their medical supplies. Though Blackwood Basin had exiled them, mocked them, and left them to die, Clara refused to abandon human beings to the cold if anyone remained alive in that silent valley. Together with Elliot and Katsa, Clara set out across the deep snowdrifts toward the silent settlement, following the line of the frozen creek, unsure of what horror they would find when they reached the town. When Clara, Elliot, and Katsa arrived in Blackwood Basin, the sight that met them was horrific beyond description. The town was a frozen graveyard. Huge snowdrifts buried houses to their eaves, and the doors of several cabins hung wide open, filled with packed snow. The townspeople, having burned through their firewood by the 3rd day, had been forced out of their individual homes as their hearths failed. In a desperate bid for survival, all 38 residents had crowded into the town's largest timber structure, the community meeting hall, hoping that their combined body heat and the hall's large stone stove would keep them alive. Targeted by the full force of the wind, the uninsulated meeting hall had turned into an icebox. The wet, frozen logs they burned had filled the hall with thick smoke, blinding the occupants and causing severe respiratory failure. When their fuel finally ran out entirely on the 5th night, the temperature inside the hall dropped to 20 below zero. Out of the 38 settlers who had entered the hall, 28 had perished from hypothermia, cold exposure, and lung suffocation. Only 10 people remained alive, huddled together under a pile of damp blankets around the cold, ash-filled stove, barely conscious and hovering minutes from death. Among the survivors were Magistrate Gideon Vance and his daughter Abigail. Gideon's hands were black with frostbite, and Abigail was so weak from cold and lung inflammation that she could no longer lift her head or speak. Elliot and Clara immediately went to work. They cleared the ice from the hall doorway, brought in dry wood from their sled, and built a small, clean fire in the stove to begin warming the air slowly. Clara ladled hot, nutrient-dense venison broth into tin cups, feeding the weak survivors tablespoon by tablespoon, while Katsa prepared a warm tea of chokecherry bark to clear their choked, rattling lungs. As the 10 survivors slowly regained consciousness, wrapped in warm blankets brought from the outcast homestead, Gideon Vance looked up at Clara. The powerful, arrogant magistrate who had evicted her 6 months before was now a broken, weeping man. He looked at Clara's face, then at the quiet Shoshone elder who was tenderly wrapping his frostbitten hands in clean wool, and burst into tears. Gideon wept open tears of shame, confessing that their foolish pride, their prejudice, and their blind arrogance had destroyed their families and killed their town. He admitted that they had believed themselves superior because of their timber houses and white heritage, while despising the very wisdom that could have saved every life in the valley. Abigail reached out her trembling, frostbitten hand and took Clara's fingers, her voice a breathless whisper as she begged for Clara's forgiveness. She admitted that Clara had not been the one who was lost out in the wilderness. It was the town that had been blind all along. Clara held her former friend's hand gently, offering no harsh words or lectures. The horrific loss in the room was punishment enough. She helped carry the 10 survivors onto the sled, wrapping them securely against the cold, and brought them out to the 4-mile homestead that everyone had claimed was a death trap. When the freezing survivors were carried through the doorway of Clara's half-sod cabin, the sudden wave of 64-degree warmth hit them like a physical shock. Gideon Vance reached out his hand and touched the inner sod wall, feeling the gentle, steady heat radiating from the earth and stone. He looked at the simple iron stove burning a tiny fire of 6 small logs, then looked through the doorway at the chaff-packed wall gap that he had called savage trash. He fell to his knees on the clean timber floor, pressing his forehead against the warm sod, finally understanding that true intelligence was not found in pride or expensive materials, but in the humble, quiet respect for the laws of the earth. The 10 survivors remained at Clara and Elliot's homestead for 3 weeks until the spring thaw arrived and the mountain passes opened. When Blackwood Basin was eventually rebuilt the following year, it was not built with rigid timber boxes or open wood piles. Under the direction of Gideon Vance and the surviving settlers, every new home constructed in the valley incorporated Katsa's double-wall chaff envelope and the slope wind deflection trench, turning the once exiled homestead into the official blueprint for high plains architecture across the Wyoming Territory. In the late spring of 1879, when the mountain snows finally melted and the prairie bloomed with wild blue flax, Clara walked up the green hill behind her cabin to the quiet spot where Katsa loved to sit. The old man had lived to see the spring, watching with quiet satisfaction as his lessons took root across the entire valley before passing peacefully in his sleep that April. Clara placed a fresh, folded ribbon of inner chokecherry bark beside a handful of wild prairie roses at the foot of his stone honor mound, honoring the quiet master who had taught her that wisdom, dignity, and truth will always outlive human cruelty and pride. Thank you for watching this story of frontier resilience and forgotten ingenuity. If this story moved you or taught you something new about the power of traditional knowledge, please hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing historical survival stories every week. Drop a comment below and let us know what part of Katsa's design impressed you the most. This video presents a historically inspired narrative reconstruction created for educational and storytelling purposes. While the characters, names, and specific dramatic events are fictionalized, Mambleding techniques described, including double-wall air gaps, chaff insulation, fluid dynamic wind deflection trenches, and the medicinal use of chokecherry inner bark are grounded in real 19th century historical practices and established principles of physics and thermodynamics. Modern construction and medical choices should always be evaluated according to current building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation.